Hello, everybody. Welcome. I am your host for today, Historic Josh 25, and today is the first official video of my hopefully future series that a lot of you guys like, my historic rants or history rants, whatever you want to call them. Today's topic that I'll be discussing is why the United States declared its independence, and I'm going to discuss how the sequence of events are interconnected with one another. Before we get talking about the interconnectedness of everything, I just kind of want to give a brief little timeline, kind of leading up to why we ended up declaring our independence. But we're going to be stepping back to 1453. Several hundred years before, almost 300 years, over 300 years before we declared our independence. Constantinople, modern-day Istanbul, was a center of Christianity, and the Byzantine Empire was unfortunately on its deathbed. Constantinople served as the gateway to Asian trade and goods for Europeans. When the Ottoman Empire conquered it in 1453, trade with Asia belonged to the Ottomans and the Muslims. This led Christopher Columbus to try to find an alternate route to Asia. They didn't want all this trade going to the Ottoman Empire as it was at the time, because it was making the Ottomans wealthy, and then they couldn't get any of that wealth away from the Ottoman Empire. So, by the 1500s, Spain and Portugal colonized most of South America with a treaty that divided the land sanctioned by the Pope, called the Treaty of, hopefully I don't mispronounce this, Tordesillas. They wanted to find a different route to Asia to continue trading, but they also ended up dividing the New World up between Spain and Portugal. By 1600, England wanted to join in the colonization of the Americas and would send settlers to modern-day Virginia. Of course, we know about Roanoke. That was about the 1580s. But by 1607, the first official British colony, is founded, Jamestown. By 1620, the Plymouth colony was founded by Puritans, and the Mayflower Compact would play a huge role in the way that the colonies would govern themselves. It started in Plymouth Colony with the Puritans, and the Mayflower Compact dictated the idea of self-governance and the idea that the colonies would kind of rule themselves a little independently from Great Britain. By 1622, there was a patent for the province of Maine was issued, and then reissued later in 1939 by Charles I, but Maine would be absorbed by Massachusetts by 1658. So it was no longer its own independent colony. It was part of Massachusetts. Stepping back, 1628, the Massachusetts Bay Colony was founded by more Puritans. 1629, the province of New Hampshire was founded. Also, in 1629, the province of Carolina was founded. It was just one big province south of Virginia. By 1632, the province of Maryland was founded. By 1636, the Connecticut colony was founded as well. Connecticut was kind of founded when a lot of the colonies around Massachusetts would be founded when people left Massachusetts because they weren't a big fan of the attitude of the Puritans at the time. By the 1600s, the mid 1600s, there was a lot of religious tensions, a lot of religious problems, as people were basically, they became outcasts. That's what led the Puritans to leave. They were outcasts from England. Between 1636 and 1642, 4 different cities were founded that would become the Rhode Island colony. By 1664, Delaware colony originally called the Lower Counties on the Delaware until 1776, was founded. 1664, New Amsterdam, a previous Dutch colony, is renamed to New York and established as a colony. It was conquered. I don't know if it was conquered or bought by the British, but it was a Dutch colony. Eventually, it became British. By 1664, the colony of New Jersey was founded when it was broken off from, I believe, New Jersey was broken off from the colony of New York. By 1681, Pennsylvania was founded as a colony by the Quakers. Plymouth and Massachusetts would unite into one colony by 1691. By 1712, the province of Carolina was split into North and South Carolina due to differences in their kind of cultures and the way that they acted. They had two different ports that they would use for trade. So by 1712, they would become two separate colonies. And then by 1732, the last of our colonies was founded, the colony of Georgia. By the 1730s, you had several different major groups of religious groups in the colonies. In New England, it was mainly Puritan. The middle colonies was very much mixed, Quakers, Lutherans, Anglicans, and many other different people escaping from the religious tensions and religious persecutions in Europe. The southern colonies were heavily Anglican at the time. So between 1600 and 1754, the colonies were largely independent. They governed themselves, setting their own taxes, electing their governors and other leaders, and so on. Their religious freedom from England led them to form their own identities that were different from their counterparts in England, though many colonists considered themselves British nonetheless. That's an idea that they never left, as even though their identities changed, their cultures changed, they still considered themselves British. Just like how in the US, someone from New Orleans may say they're American as much as someone from New York may say they're American. They have different cultures, but they're still American. More Enlightenment ideas such as individual liberties and natural rights would begin to spread like wildfire through the colonies. By 1754, Britain and France were building empires in the New World, and the Ohio River Valley was the newest contested area. Both had begun building forts in the region as they attempted to strengthen their influence there, and this resulted in what would become the French and Indian War. It would eventually change its name, though, at least for the Europeans. In America, we kept it the French and Indian War. When a couple of years later, when Britain joined in the fight, it became known as the 7 Years' War, and it became a global conflict by 1756, 2 years later. Between 1754 and 1756, the war was contained to North America, but Britain saw their colonial militias could not stand up to the French and their native allies. They were getting butchered, resulting in lost battles like the Battle of Fort Necessity on July 3rd, 1754. That was a battle led by the George Washington when he was a young officer in the British Army. He was sent to capture a fort. I think it was a French fort. They would get ambushed, and he built a small fort. He called it Fort Necessity, and he was forced to end up surrendering his forces over. He would surrender to the French after they ran out of supplies. General Braddock's disastrous expedition that saw Braddock die, which I think was 1754 as well, or 1755. That was another horrible expedition. George Washington was also on that one. He would lead the troops out of there. By 1756, England would declare war on France and send troops to North America to help their colonies. Now, of course, when you have to raise and send troops, that gets expensive, so they were taking loans out at this time. Keep that in mind. After the war, England was deeply in debt from raising and sending troops to fight not only in North America, but Europe, India, and other parts of the world. This would play a key role in how the British Parliament would treat the 13 colonies moving forward. So up until 1754, the colonies dictated themselves. They put up their own taxes, their own rules, and then they just sent money over to Great Britain, which wasn't a lot. It was actually, Great Britain was losing money in the 13 colonies. They were getting more money out of their sugar plantation colonies in the Caribbean, in South America. They had a couple of colonies in South America. But the 13 colonies was a money drain for Great Britain. And so they decided to change it. In 1763, which was roughly the end of the French and Indian War, many settlers, British settlers, and British colonists began moving into the Ohio Territory. They just fought a war so that they could move in. But Pontiac, a Native American, I hope I pronounced this correctly, Ottawa, pardon me if I mispronounced it, leader, led a rebellion against the encroaching British settlers west of the Appalachian Mountains. This led the British Parliament to enact the Proclamation of 1763, forbidding colonists from moving west of the Appalachian Mountains. This enraged many colonists who fought in the French and Indian War to be able to gain the right to move west of the mountains. Now betrayed by their own government, the first crack begins to form between the British colonies and their motherland. The following year, 1764, still in debt, England needs to find a way to make up the money they lost raising troops and sending them to fight in the French and Indian War, or 7 Years' War. In need of money and still wanting the 13 colonies to pay their fair share of protection, the British government passes the Sugar Act. This act taxed any non-British sugar shipments in the colonies. French sugar was cheaper than British at the time, and this tax, when it was implemented, saw a lot of smuggling of sugar into the colonies, because French molasses, and I don't know about Dutch, I don't know if they had their own sugar plantations, but the French did, was ultimately cheaper than what the British could offer. So they put a tax on anything that wasn't British sugar. 1765, you have the Stamp Act and the Quartering Act. So, to help pay for the troops who were stationed in the American colonies during the 7 Years' War, or the French and Indian War, same thing, the Stamp Act was passed. This put a tax on every piece of paper from playing cards to newspapers. It caused a massive uproar in the colonies. Around this time, people began using the no taxation without representation slogan. It is believed that this is the origin of that saying. The Quartering Act would be passed shortly thereafter in an attempt to make the colonies pay for any and all troops stationed in the colonies. It made it mandatory for the colonies to raise taxes to pay for British troops in the colonies. It also allowed British troops to stay in homes, inns, livery stables, ale houses, and other public places. So they were attempting to make the colonies self-sufficient in supplying, paying, and quartering the British troops stationed within the 13 colonies for the protection of those colonies. By 1766, so this is 1 year after that, the Declaratory Act and the repealment of the Stamp Act and Sugar Act. The Declaratory Act was passed by the British government to assert their authority over the 13 colonies. At the same time that the Declaratory Act was passed, the Stamp Act was repealed and the Sugar Act would be repealed as well. They backtracked on some of their acts, seeing that the colonies were getting upset. They were starting to push back against these acts. They were not liking the fact that Britain was taxing them. But again, Britain was taxing them because they just went into a lot of debt protecting these same colonies just a couple of years earlier during the French and Indian War. By 1767 and 1768, you get the Townshend Acts. The Townshend Acts were named after the British Chancellor Charles Townshend. He was the Chancellor of the Exchequer, I think is what they were, what his title was. No idea what that is, but Chancellor Charles Townshend. It put a tax on various items such as lead, glass, and tea. These taxes were meant to help pay for colonial administration. By 1770, we get the Boston Massacre, the infamous Boston Massacre, due to growing tensions between the colonists in Boston and Britain over the Townshend Acts 2 years earlier. So there's a gap between 1768 and 1770 where growing tensions and resistance to the Townshend Acts. Due to growing tensions between the colonists in Boston and Britain over the Townshend Acts, a group of colonists formed a mob and harassed a lone sentry on King Street in Boston. And soon, several more soldiers came to the sentry's aid. The mob soon began throwing snowballs and rocks at the soldiers, and soon one soldier fired. After that, this led the remaining troops to open fire. Three British colonists died and 8 were wounded. Of course, it is famously depicted as them giving an order to fire a volley it's the famous engraving by Paul Revere. There is not much truth to that image, though. It is propaganda is what it was, by Paul Revere, vilifying the British at the time. 2 years later, you have the Gaspee Affair. The HMS Gaspee was a British revenue schooner, which is a small ship that was chasing a smaller colonial packet ship. The Gaspee ran aground, and colonists boarded and burned the Gaspee down. So, the Gaspee meant to enforce the Navigation Acts. The colonists managed to pull it into a trap where it ran aground near a small island outside of, I believe it was Rhode Island is where they were, and a bunch of colonists that were hiding near that spot boarded the ship and burned it down. So more and more cracks are starting to form, and it's 1772. 1773, the Tea Act and the Boston Tea Party. So the British Parliament passed the Tea Act in early 1773. It made British tea cheap to sell in the colonies. They hoped to help the British East India Company, which was running into financial troubles. They had warehouses full of tea in England, and they had nowhere they could sell it. So the Tea Act was passed in hopes that the colonists would buy this British tea. It was dirt cheap at the time. One thing was that some of the ships, I believe, could not leave until their cargo was unloaded. Resistance to the Tea Act came in the form of preventing these ships from unloading their cargo, so the ships could not leave until their cargo was unloaded. This culminated in the Boston Tea Party, which of course we all know they dumped crates of tea into the harbor. Of course, to show resistance against the Tea Act, a group of men, some who disguised themselves as Native Americans, boarded a merchant ship full of tea, crates of tea. The ship was causing a holdup since it couldn't unload its cargo because the colonists were preventing it from unloading its cargo. So to help unload the ship, they threw the crates of tea into the harbor. This is when we get 1774, the Intolerable Acts, and the First Continental Congress. So, in response to the Boston Tea Party, the British government passed the Intolerable Acts, a series of acts to punish the city of Boston for the Boston Tea Party the previous year. Such acts closed down the Boston Harbor, passed a new quartering act to station troops in and around Boston, and gave more power to the governor of Massachusetts, as well as other acts. During this time, the First Continental Congress met and drafted a list of grievances to King George and stated the natural rights of the colonists, hoping to reach a peaceful ending to the growing tensions between the colonies and the British government. 1774, the last year of peace before tensions explode in 1775. Of course, the paper that they drafted, the list of grievances, of course, kind of fell on deaf ears because the British government were, at this point, upset and tired with the colonies. They saw them as a bunch of kids, children throwing a temper tantrum. So, 1775 rolls around. It is the most pivotal year before the American Revolution officially starts in 1776. By 1775, all of this growing tension over the Tea Acts, the Intolerable Acts, the Townshend Acts, the Quartering Acts, all these other stuff, culminates into 1775. The battles of Lexington and Concord, the Battle of Bunker Hill, the Battle of Fort Ticonderoga, and the start of the Second Continental Congress. With tensions growing between the Continentals and the British Crown, militias around Boston began stockpiling weapons and gunpowder in the town of Concord, Massachusetts, approximately 20 miles away from Boston. When the British learned that the colonists were storing weapons, a group of soldiers, around 700 soldiers, were sent to capture the arms to disarm the rebels. At this point, the colonists, the British colonists, though many of them are starting to kind of lose that identity of American or of British colonists, and some are saying, "Hey, I'm American, not British." But when the British Parliament and the British government learned about these weapons, 700 troops were dispatched to capture their arms. A small group would stop in the town of Lexington, 15 miles away from Boston, so 5 miles away from Concord, to arrest Sam Adams and John Hancock, who were believed to be hiding within Lexington. When the British regulars arrived in Lexington, Hancock and Adams were gone, and they were greeted instead by 77 Minutemen. After a shot rang out, the shot heard around the world, the regulars opened fire, causing the Minutemen to panic and run. Several Americans were killed and wounded during the Battle of Lexington, and I believe maybe one British soldier was wounded, maybe none. I couldn't find specific numbers. The regulars would pursue the Minutemen to Concord, where they were greeted by a larger militia force. The British would fail to capture the colonial weapons, but word would spread quickly of the battles, and soon more militia from around the countryside poured towards Lexington and Concord. As the British retreated the full 20 miles back, they were harassed every step of the way by colonial militia in the wood lines behind houses and bushes. 20 miles of marching, probably 40 in one day, because they set out the night before, marched out through the night, got into Lexington early in the morning, and then had to fight in Lexington, marched 5 more miles towards Concord, got in the fight on Concord, and they immediately set back towards Boston, 20 miles more. These battles, as words spread, pushed many colonials to outrage and support for the freedom from Britain. Shortly after this, the Second Continental Congress would convene to discuss the future of the 13 colonies. At the same time, Ethan Allen and Benedict Arnold would capture Fort Ticonderoga, seizing its cannons for the Continental Army. By June, the city of Boston was completely under siege by colonial militia forces. The British, seeking to capture the high ground of Bunker Hill, prepared a force to take and fortify the hill. Colonial spies, though, in the city of Boston would get word and send it to the militias to fortify Bunker Hill. They managed to fortify the hill of Bunker Hill, but then they would send part of their force to fortify the smaller Breed's Hill. On the morning of June 17th, 1775, the British forces would assault and capture Breed's Hill. Although they won, it was a staggering cost of lives. When the Americans suffered roughly 450 casualties, the British lost 1,054 casualties, dead and wounded. The Battle of Bunker Hill would become American propaganda to bolster their cause and instill them with confidence. By 1775, all of the tension growing over the taxes, over the Boston Tea Party, the Boston Massacre, the Proclamation line, all of that tension culminated in 1775 in these battles that would spark the American Revolutionary War. And the world would change forever because of a series of events that culminated in tensions in 1775. And it pushed the Continental Congress to say, we're done with the British. We're done being colonists for them. We are Americans. Thank you, everybody, so much for listening to me rant on about the start of the American Revolutionary War. If you have any ideas that you want to see me rant about, please post them in the comments below, and I will rant about whatever you guys have in mind for me or whatever you want to hear. I appreciate you guys so much for listening to me rant for however long, and I hope to see you in the next video or the next stream. Have a good day.